Welcome to TrackVia's Tips and Tricks. Today we're using app scripts to display error messages, and our presenters will be Derek and Christina. But first we're going to try out some housekeeping issues and go over them. First of all, you are in listen only mode, so please keep it in listen only so everyone can hear the presentation. If you do have a question, please submit it through the chat window and we'll follow up with those that we don't answer live. The webinar is being recorded and we'll send you that recording in a follow-up email within 48 hours. That's really all the housekeeping that we have today, so I'm going to hand it over to Christina. Have a good webinar.
Hello everyone, my name is Christina. I'm an implementation engineer here at TrackVia. I've been with the team for about 3.5 years now, and I keep learning new things every day, which is why I'm happy to be here to share some of those tips and tricks I've learned along the way. Derek, all yours.
Awesome, thanks. Welcome everyone to our monthly admin tips and tricks webinar. Excited for everyone to be here again. I'm Derek. I lead our training efforts here at TrackVia. Super excited to have Christina on the line today. She's one of our rock star implementation engineers. So she's going to teach us all about app scripts, or a piece of app scripts that you can use in your own apps. So before we get started, let's just go through a quick agenda. We're just going to do some level setting here up front, talk a little bit about what app scripts are, so make sure we're all on the same page with our understanding of that. And then we'll talk about what app script errors are, right? And common use cases for implementing them within your applications. Then we'll hand it over to Christina. She's going to go through a demo and show us some examples of how to use those in our own apps, in real life scenarios. Then we'll come back. We'll just talk about some of the key concepts, the key takeaways. If there's going to be some things that you learn, it's these things. And then we'll do questions and wrap things up with just some information at the end. Okay. So let's go ahead and jump into it here. Starting with what are app scripts, right? Most of you might be familiar with app scripts are. For those of you that aren't, app scripts are little snippets of code that you can add to your applications that provide a level of automation for your apps, okay? If there's a manual process that your users are doing repetitively, a lot of times you can write an app script to do that for them, so they don't have to do that over and over and over again. Okay, app scripts are written in Groovy, and they are attached to a particular table. You can attach tables, or you can attach app scripts to tables. They get executed when data is manipulated in the system. So if a record is added to TrackVia, or edited, or deleted, those are the things that can trigger your app scripts to run. Okay, now app scripts are super flexible. They can do a ton of different things. Really, with app scripts, kind of your imagination is the limit for what they can do, right? A little corny, but true. So we're going to show you one way that you can use them today, right? So that's what we're talking about. We are going to be now switching gears to talk about error messages. Now, when we think about error messages, most people think about there's an issue, right? I'm seeing an error message, there's an issue. And there's a lot of different types of error messages that are displayed because of issues. One of them would be from timeouts, okay? If your app script takes too long to run, then you might see an error message pop up. And you may be familiar with these error messages. They're little orange little pop-ups in the bottom right corner of your account. And it'll give you some info. It'll say, you know, your app script took too long to run, something like that, right? So that's one example of why you might see an error message from an app script as a timeout. The other issue that commonly causes those pop-ups is a referential error, meaning the app script is referencing something, it's looking for something, and it's not finding that thing, okay? A lot of times it's like a field. If it's looking for a field and it's not finding that field, maybe the field got deleted or the name of it changed or whatever it might be, then it's going to produce an error, and it's going to tell you, hey, can't find that field that I'm looking for, okay? Now, that's the first type of error message that can be displayed. The second type, and what we're actually going to be talking more and a lot about today, is an intentional app script error message, okay? This is something that we decide that we want to display to the end user to give them some information, right? Maybe we want to tell them something about the data entry process. Maybe they're doing something wrong. We want to give them a message and lead them down the correct path. Okay, so these are intentional error messages. All right, now when we think about intentional error messages, we can really group them into 3 buckets. Okay, the first bucket, or common use case, really, is for process evaluation. Okay? And this one's a little abstract and depends on your specific use case. Okay, but imagine you have a process that gets completed within TrackVia. And maybe that process is 5 or 10 steps long. Okay, and there's multiple people that need to engage in that process at different points in time. Well, through an app script, we can ensure that the users are interacting and completing their steps at the right time. Okay. Now, an example of this is when a user goes into TrackVia and they, fill out a form, an app script can run and evaluate kind of the environment surrounding the record that they just modified or added, right? It can check for things like, hey, has somebody already entered that record before, right? So going out and looking and seeing if there's another record. Or maybe it's going out and evaluating, hey, are there child records attached to this record, right? Or, maybe has the process before or the step before them in that process been completed, right? There's a lot of different ways that you could do this with app scripts, but the idea is if they're doing it at the wrong time or in the wrong way, we can pop up a message in the bottom right corner of the window that says, hey, you need to wait until this has been approved before you can do whatever else it is, right? As an example. Okay, so process evaluation, checking the surrounding environment to see if what they're doing is they should be doing at that time. Okay, the next bucket is a little bit more straightforward and a little bit easier to understand. It has to do with data validation. Okay, so if we put ourselves in the end user's shoes, they're in TrackVia, maybe they're filling out a form. That form has a lot of fields on it, and they're different types of fields, right? There's a very real possibility that we might want them to enter data in a very specific way in those fields. Okay? For example, maybe there's a phone number field. It's just a single line field in TrackVia. And you want to make sure that they only put 10 characters into that field, right? You can use a script to check, did they enter 10 characters? If they did, great, don't do anything. If they didn't, give them an error message that says, hey, you entered 12 characters here. The limit is 10. Please fix the phone number field, whatever it might be. Okay, maybe you have a checkbox field and there's 10 options in the checkbox field and you want them to choose only one of those options. Or maybe you want them to choose up to 5 options in a specific checkbox field, right? There's a lot of things, a lot of ways that you could do that. But if they choose too many or too few, give an error message that says, hey, revisit your checkbox field. Or another common one is maybe you have 2 date fields, a start date and an end date. Think about, you go online, you book a flight, there's a departure date and a return date if you're going round trip on a flight. And the return date has to be after the departure date, of course, right? So we can use an app script to check to make sure that's the case, to make sure the end date is after the start date. And if it's not, display an error message. I've discovered that saying orange error message is really hard, so bear with me if I mess that up. But either way, using app scripts to display those messages if they're not doing their data entry properly. Okay, and there's a million other variations on that. That's just a couple of the flavors there that we just went through for examples. Okay, the third bucket is arguably the most common use case for displaying error messages, and that's conditional requirements. Okay, so what we know about TrackVia is at the table level, you can mark a field required. At the form level, you can mark a field required. But what you can't do is conditionally require a field, meaning if something is, a field A is filled out, then require field B. Okay. Now we can do that, and we do it frequently with app scripts. Okay. And the idea is the app script checks to see if the condition is true, and if it is, or if it's not, then it will output that error message and say, hey, you filled out field A, you have to fill out field B to continue. Or maybe field A is equal to X, then fill out field B. Then you have to require field B. Another example out of left field is, hey, if it's Monday, make sure you fill out this field, right? You can do this in a lot of different ways. But conditionally requiring a field using an app script and an error message, super, super common. Okay. So those are the three main use cases. All right, so we're going to move on to some examples and a demo from Christina. Before we do that, I just want to say, remember, please answer or ask your questions in the chat as Christina is going through this demo. So if you have them, don't wait till the end. You can just send them through, and we'll either pick them up right in line there, or if it makes sense to do it at the end, we can do it at the end as well. Okay, so just check the questions in as you have them. The other reminder, one other thing that I want to mention here is that at the end of Christina's presentation, she's going to be asking everyone for ways that they think they could use this feature in their own accounts, right? So if you find a way that you think you can use this, write it down, because at the end we'll kind of share those. We'll ask everyone to share those ideas in chat so we can learn from each other, right? To see how many ideas of ways that we can use this as possible, right? And this is a great way for everyone to get as many of those ideas into place as possible. So be thinking of that as Christina goes through. All right, so thanks. And Christina, without further ado, we'll turn it over to you to actually jump into TrackVia for the fun stuff.
Awesome, thank you, Derek. Let me just switch screens here real quick. So we're going to use an expense reporting application for me to show you how these error messages can be used, right? So quick agenda. First, I'll show you the overview of the app and the architecture. Then we'll go through the workflow that we built out for this demo without the error messages. And then we'll cover the 3 different use cases that we would use the error messages for, right? So just the overview, the application that we're going to be using is an expense reporting app. And if we look at our ERD, if we look at our structure, it's a fairly simple structure, right? We create an expense report, then we create expenses that are attached to that expense report, and we can also attach customers to that expense. Okay, so let's go back. We only have one dashboard in this application, and it's an expense reporting app. And I'll demonstrate how this workflow will flow. So let's go ahead and I'll create an expense report. Let's say that the start date is today, June 23rd, and then the end date is July 23rd. So it spans for a month, and then I'm going to attach this expense report to myself. I'll save the report, and then what I'm going to do next is I'll go ahead and create an expense that's going to be attached to that report, right? So I'll select the expense report, June 23rd to July 23rd. This is the one. Let's say that I used the car rental company Turo. The purchase date was today, and it cost me $50. So this expense type is going to be a transportation expense type. If I'd like, I can upload a receipt, whether it's like a document or an image field. I can upload the documents here. And then I can select whether it's billable, yes or no, right? So I'll go ahead and select yes, and the customer will be Good Burger. So as soon as I hit save, you'll see that the expense has been created, right? The vendor Turo, I created my expense, it's attached to the expense report, and I'm done with the workflow. So now we've covered 3 of the resources, right? We created the report, we created the expense, we saw where that expense was created, and then we have this view here called expense type limits. So this just shows us how much an expense can be, like the maximum based on the type. So we'll just use this later for the error messages. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what this view will be used for. So now that we've done this workflow without the error messages, I'm going to show you 3 different scenarios that we identified where we could use error messages, right, to prevent unwanted situations. So let's go ahead and create the first one. So let's say that I create another expense report with the same start date, the same end date, and it's attached to me as well. So essentially, I'm creating a duplicate expense report. So if I go ahead and try and click save, you'll notice that this orange error message shows up that says you already have an expense report created for the selected dates. So this is a great way of using error messages to prevent the duplication of records. So now let's take a look at how we made this happen. Because I'm trying to create an expense report, the application script will be written at the expense reports table. So I'm going to edit the expense reports table. I'll go to the application script section, and then you'll see that there's a before insert application script. Before insert basically means that this line of code will happen before the record is even created, right? So the first part, which is this right here, this is trying to find an existing expense report that already has the same values of the expense report I'm trying to create. So we first create a variable, and then we are going to load a record. So we're going to find a record on the expense reports table, which is the table I'm on, where the start date is the same as what I'm trying to enter, the end date is the same as what I'm trying to enter, and the employee is the same as what I'm trying to enter. And then this is just the name of the application, Error Messages Webinar. So this part is just finding the record. If it finds a record that is exactly the same across these 3 parameters, then it's going to throw this error message. So this key that you see here, throw new runtime exception, this is the key to displaying the error to the user. So this is the syntax that you'd use when you want the error to show up, right? And then this part is customizable. You can enter whatever you would like here. This is what the user will see in that error message. But this part, I would say this is the main part. This is the syntax that allows you to throw the error message. And then one additional thing to add here is that if this is true and we throw the error message, everything else, if there was more code written below this line, it's just going to stop. It will not run because we stopped the creation of the record, right? So anything that's written underneath will not run if we throw this error message. All right, so let's go back to our dashboard. And we are going to go through the second example of the error messages, okay? So let's say that I am going to submit an expense for that same expense report, and the vendor is Southwest, right? I went on a flight to visit a customer. The purchase date is today, the amount is $1,500, and the expense type is airfare. I could upload receipts if I'd like. I'll say that this is billable. Billable to Good Burger. So if I try and hit save, I get another error message, and this says the amount entered exceeds the limit allowed for airfare expenses, right? Because if we look at our view, our first view up here, we have this expense type limit that says for airfare, you cannot expense more than $800, right? So in our script, which I'll show you later, we have it so that if this amount exceeds the amount set at the limit, it's gonna throw that error. So let's just see it again. Right, because the amount was greater, it's gonna give us the error message. So let's go ahead and see how we wrote that application script. So because this is an expense, we're submitting an expense, this application script will be written in the expenses table, right? So let's go ahead and edit the table. Go to the application script section, and similarly to before, we have the script in the before insert event type because we want it to run before the expense is even created, right? So what we're doing here is we're first creating a variable that contains the value that we selected in the amount field. So in my example, that was $1,500, right? So in this variable, the number $1,500 is being stored. Then the expense type limit, this variable is storing the limit for whatever expense type I chose. So because I chose the expense type of airfare, the limit was $800. So the variable, the value that's stored in this variable will be $800. If I had chosen a different expense type, let's say transportation, then the limit would have been different, right? And the variable stored would have had a different value. But just to keep using the example I showed you, the expense amount was $1,500, so that's what's going to be stored here. And the expense type limit was $800, so that's what's going to be stored here. So then what we do is that we're going to do a simple comparison, right? If the expense amount, which is the $1,500, if that's greater than the expense type limit, which is the $800, then throw this runtime exception. I'll go through line 9 in a second, but I just wanted to show you that, again, we use the same key and then we customize the error message. So now something pretty cool that you can do in runtime exceptions is that you can add variables within the error message. So for example, here we have a variable that is showing us, or actually is storing what type of expense was it. If it was an airfare expense, then I'm going to see the word airfare in my error message. If it was a transportation expense type, then I'm going to see the word transportation in the error message. So it's just a way to make the error message dynamic, right? So yeah, that's going to be our second example, dynamic error messages.
Christina, we've got a good question. We've got a couple of questions coming in. Thanks, everyone. One of them I think makes sense to touch on now from Ted. Ted, Christina, is asking about, and we can actually, I think Ted, you asked it for a different, the previous script, but I think it applies here too. The line 4, Christina, where we are declaring that the variable expense amount as a double. And then we are setting that equal to a field from TrackVia, the current values of the field amount, right? So the field amount. Ted is asking about the text at the very end of that line as double, and what that does. So I don't know if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're declaring what type of variable it is. So double, it's a way of saying it's a number, right? So we're declaring that the expense amount is a number. So this part is going to be addressing the variable. And then once we say as double, it's basically saying that the current values of amount, it's also going to have that same variable type. Derek, do you want to expand on that?
That's perfect, right? We have to tell the script what the variable is, and then when we pull the value out of the field, we also need to tell the script what that is, right? So we're just saying it's also a number, a double, which is a type of number, right? In the last one we saw, we were declaring a map and then pulling something out as a map. Same thing. Yep. Cool. All right. Thanks, Christina.
Perfect. All right, so now let's go through our third and final example. So we are going to touch on conditionally required fields, which is, I think, one of the most common use cases for runtime exceptions. So let's go ahead and I'll create another expense report. We're going to use Southwest again. The purchase date is today, the amount, we'll just keep it under the limit, and the expense type is airfare. So if I select this expense as billable and I hit save, I'll get another one of these error messages. And it says, you must select the billable customer before proceeding, right? So this is a clear example where if the billable field says yes, I have to enter a value in the customer field, because if not, I get this error. So this is a prime example of conditionally required fields. So if I go ahead and select a customer, it goes through, right? So let's take a look at how that app script is written. So again, because I'm submitting an expense, this application script will be written on the expenses table. And then it's a bit shorter. And this one, what this is saying is if the current values of billable, so if that billable field is equal to yes, and if the customer field is blank, so that's what this exclamation point means. It means it's blank. So if these two criteria are met, then throw the runtime exception, which says you must select the billable customer before proceeding, right? So this is an and statement. If the billable option is yes and the customer is blank, throw the error. So because this is the last error message, I just want to point out that these application scripts are not written in constants, just because this is a demonstration and it is much easier to read the script if we write out the field name as opposed to using constants. That said, it is best practices to always use constants when you're writing application scripts, because if you change a field name, you don't have to worry about your application script breaking if you're using constants, right? So constants can be found in this tab towards the right. You'll see this arrow, and if you click it open, these are the system IDs, also known as constants. And what this does is it essentially uses the underlying ID of a field instead of just the name. You can to learn more about constants, you can go to our knowledge base or to our on-demand TVU courses, but I just wanted to mention that it is best practices to use constants. All right. So Derek warned you that we'd love for you guys to share examples of runtime exceptions that you're currently using in your app, or examples of where you would consider adding runtime exceptions in your app now that you've learned about them. So yeah, send in your examples and we'll read them out loud and see what cool ideas we get.
And while we're waiting for some of those ideas, Christina, Michael would like to see the first example again. So maybe we can just pull up, I don't know if Michael, you're looking for just the script or the whole thing. So, but maybe we can just pull up that script so Michael can see. Yeah. So this was the script for the first one. All right. Send in your ideas. Okay, so
All right.
see, yeah, go ahead, Christina, you can read.
Yeah, the first one that came in is phone number validation. So that's a pretty common one and a great one to use this application scripts for. Yep.
You can get really specific with phone number validation, by the way. You can require that there's, parentheses with 3 digits and then 3 more and a dash and form, however you want to form it, you can get real specific.
It looks like someone else is using them for data validation and conditionally required fields. Yep, absolutely.
I think those are probably the two most used.
Yep. We also have some, like what Derek was saying at the beginning, making sure that the start date is before the end date. That's another common one. Conditionally required fields. Yep.
Michael says, check another conditional requirements. If this, then require that. Yep. Good.
And then we can go back to the app that we used, and I can give you a couple of other areas in this small application that we could use application scripts for. So we could, for example, we could use another runtime exception so that, let's say I'm creating an expense report, right? And the expense report ranges from June 23rd to July 23rd. And let's say that the purchase date it is outside of that range, right? Let's say that I put a purchase date of June 10th. I don't have the script written right now, but we could add a script that says that the purchase date must be within the range, right? So this is another good data validation example that we could use.
Seen a couple more come through here. Christina as well. Carissa, good to hear from you, Carissa. It's been a while. Wanting to see how constants are used to get a field name. We can cover that in a second. Keith has a long add form. So a user is going into TrackVia and filling out a long form, and it covers different types of equipment. And then Keith is conditionally requiring that some fields be filled out. I think this is what you're saying, Keith, depending on the type of equipment that's being entered. Great use case for conditionally required. Leslie, requiring a subcontractor to have a specific company name. Okay. And Leslie again, conditionally required. Yep, conditionally required seems to be a big one. All right, Charisse. Let's see. Forms have a lot of non-required fields which should be required. This will help them easily identify what is required. Yep, absolutely. Ooh, I like this one from Michael as well. A negative conditional requirements. That's a good one, right?
Yeah.
If a field is filled out, don't fill out another field, right? Kind of the opposite. Great way to do it. Yep. I got the question. We can get to that in a second. Lots of date validation. Start date before end date. Yep. All right. Okay. What do you think, Christine? Is that enough ideas? Should we move on to questions? There's a lot of questions coming through. I love it.
Yeah.
All right. let's do some of these questions before we get to the wrap up. How about that?
Yep, love it.
Okay. All right, cool. Maybe we can just kind of alternate here. So let's see. Had a message from Carlos, our good friend Carlos. Do app scripts work on offline mode? So great question, Carlos. Carlos is referring to using the TrackVia mobile application. And if you're using the mobile application and you don't have a data connection, you can still fill out your forms and perform your work as if you did have a data connection. There are a couple of things that are slight differences there. One of them is that app scripts will not run on the device in offline mode. When the data gets synced back to TrackVia, the app script will run when that record goes to get added. But when the user initially fills out that that form, the app script won't run if they're in offline mode. Let's see what else we got here. Question from Matt. What if you wanted to keep an expense report from overlapping with another expense report's dates? More of a question about using app scripts and comparing dates. Yep, that is something that you could do, a little bit trickier, but you'd essentially go get the records from the table. In this example, in the example Christina gave, we returned one record. We were looking for one record that matched exactly a few specific pieces of criteria, right? Matt, what you're describing would be, hey, let's go out and get all those expense reports and then sort through them to find any. You can kind of sort them by start and end dates and compare them to the record that just got added, and compare them to those start and end dates and see if they overlap. If they do, kick it out. If they don't, let it go through, right? So instead of looking for one record, you're pulling back many records and then looping through to find that, to find if there's any conflicting reports. All right, what else we got, Christina? A bunch of things in here.
Yeah, there's so many.
Let's see. All right, like this question from Matt. Is it possible, instead of throwing an exception, instead of producing the error message and having the save of the record be stopped, meaning the record doesn't get added to TrackVia, is it possible to have the save go through but also give them a message? With scripts, you might have to get really creative, but not really. What we're talking about here with the throw runtime exceptions, that's going to stop the save of the script every time. Okay. However, there are other ways that I think you could accomplish what you're looking for. You could potentially, for example, create a view, right? And that view could be filtered down to specific criteria, right? Maybe if they entered some fields and not others, have the record drop into the view, so then they can look at that view and see all the ones that, kind of meet that criteria that you're looking for. You could even set up notification rules on that. So maybe then they get an email saying like, hey, you filled out a record, but it didn't have X, Y, and Z, go fix that, right? So let it go through, but notify them in some way. So you can get creative, but not using the throw runtime exception that we're talking about here.
There's a few questions about the constants. I won't go into depth into those, but I mean, we can show you quickly, right? Let's say if you open the drawer, if I wanted to replace this with the actual constant for the amount field, then you'll notice that in the constant section, this is broken up by apps and then by tables. So I'll just open up the expense table, which is the table I'm on, and I'll look at the amount field. So then I would copy the clipboard. I would first, I guess, put it up here. So now I'm identifying that this amount variable is equal to this system ID, right? So then I would use this variable instead of the field name. So again, if you're interested in learning about constants, we'll have more information on our on-demand trainings or in the knowledge base.
All right. Got a question about the error message itself. Has a bunch of text in it. More text, you may have noticed, than just the text that we provided, right? And the question is, can we remove that extra text? It's definitely something that we've talked about, Matt. Currently, no, it's always going to come through. But love to hear that as a request. It's something we've talked about and would like to be able to do someday. So we'll definitely mark you down as falling into that boat. All right. Question from Ted. Will this work for flow control on mobile devices? Example, pictures being required before moving to the next step. This should work on mobile the same way that it works on web, Ted. So, if you require that a picture be uploaded to a field, you can write the script can look at that and say, hey, is there a picture in this field? If there isn't, display the error message. That's, I think, Christine, you can verify that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it should work within a flow as well.
All right. Question from different Michael. We've got a lot of Michaels on the session here today. Change the color of the error message. Can we do that? No. Right now they're always going to be orange. I'd love to never have to say orange error message again. Maybe we, it could be like yellow error message. I guess that one's hard to say too. But right now it's going to be orange. That's a great feature request, though. It would be really cool to be able to change the color of those messages. All right. From Darren, can you apply a script to a form and not a table? So in general, Darren, they're similar. They're very closely related to each other, right? You can only attach a script to a table, okay? And it has to be attached to a specific event on that table, meaning something gets inserted into the table, like a record gets added, a record gets updated, or a record gets deleted. However, you may have noticed that as Christina was going through her examples here, she's interacting with forms. And generally it's because that's, if you're adding records to the system, you're using a form, right? Like, so she's interacting with this form here. So you attach it to the table, but it does, in a sense, get applied to the form that you're interacting with as well, right? Now, it doesn't necessarily matter which form you're interacting with. So Christina is using a custom form here, but if she went to the default form and did the same thing, you'd still get that error message because the app script doesn't really care which form you're accessing it from. It just matters that you're adding something to the table. So you can see that there. All right. I think we covered it all. I apologize if we missed any of these. Do you see any others that we didn't get to, Christina?
No, I think we're good.
All right. Then let's go ahead and flip over to the takeaways and just wrap things up here. All right. So takeaways from the session today, right? Is that error messages don't have to mean that there's something wrong with the system, that it's a timeout or a referential issue. We can use them intentionally to produce information for the end user. When you do that, you're going to use the syntax throw new runtime exception, and then whatever text you want, whatever message you want to supply to the end users, you're going to put inside the parentheses and the quotes there. Typically, that's wrapped within an if statement as well, but it doesn't have to be, right? So a lot of times it is, if some condition is met, throw the error message, okay? It happens on data entry only, so adding records, editing records, and deleting records. You can't produce these messages when you go to a view or you go to a form or you go to a dashboard. You have to interact with data in some way to produce them. And then common use cases are conditionally requiring fields. If some condition is met, check to see if another field is filled out or not filled out. Love that idea. Process evaluation, right? Check the surrounding environment. Are there other fields? Are there other overlapping? That was a really good example of a process evaluation error that someone gave, right? If a expense report was created with overlapping dates, kick it out, right? And then the third one is data input, right? Make sure people are entering things in the correct way. All right, we already did questions, I think. I think we got all the questions. Oh. We do have another question. Carissa, will these work on importing? Yes. Yep. So if you're importing and something isn't filled out properly, the app script will produce an error and that record won't get entered into the system. So yes. Will it translate to the error output column? I think, do you know the answer to that question? I think it does in some scenarios in the Excel file. I think that question is about, if you do the import in the Excel file in the error column, does the script error come through? I think it does in some scenarios. I don't know if you know.
Yeah, I think I've seen it before. It's been a while, but I've seen the before insert failed because A, B, or C. So I think it does. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, and then another question from Darnell. How you would set the error to inform the user that a vendor or customer is not in an approved list, especially for a large company that has hundreds of vendors. Okay, interesting question. I think there's a couple of ways that you could do this. Some of them maybe not even related to scripts. There might be a better way to do that than using a script. Perhaps you create a vendors table and you just have your list of vendors in there. And then, when a record is being added, when they go to select the vendor, of course, they can only select the vendors from that list. That might be an elegant way to do it that doesn't require a script. But perhaps, maybe there's some scenario where you want to use a script. You could do something very similar. When they type in the vendor's name, script can go out and do something similar to what Christina showed in that first script, right? It's loading a record. It's finding a record from that table that matches a criteria. And if it finds one, block the addition. And if it doesn't find one, let the insert of the record go through. So almost identical to actually what Christina showed in that first script. And then a question from Darren about a Workato integration. Can these error messages be sent to Workato? Ooh. Do you know the answer to that, Christina?
I don't think so. I don't think with Workato we can access the error message.
That was my hunch too, but Darren, we'll get back to you on that because I'm not 100% sure. We'll get you a solid answer on whether or not these can be sent to an integration. So hang tight on that one. All right, awesome. Great participation, great questions. Thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. Let's just wrap things up real quick. Christina mentioned a couple of times that we've got an AppScript course on the on-demand university website. So if you want to get more information, learn more about how you can actually write your own scripts, that's a great resource for you. And then we also have the AppScript documentation page at developer.trackvia.com. We've recently made updates to that, and it's getting more and more robust by the day. So go check that out. If you need help, we're here to help you as well. You can contact support between the hours of 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Just pick up the phone, call them. All right, we're here to help you. And then, of course, if you need more robust help, need us to really get into your app and make some changes, do some AppScript stuff with you, we have professional services for you to leverage if you need to. Next webinar is going to be at the end of July, July 27th. Mark it on your calendars now. And we're going to be making a feedback tracking application in 30 minutes. So building an app start to finish so you can see that whole process in 30 minutes. It's going to be a good one. And then, of course, we're going to send out, I think Michelle mentioned at the beginning, the recording of this webinar. All of the webinars are also hosted on the TrackVia University website. So if you miss one, hop over there and you can watch it. And then if you have 2 minutes at the end of this, just fill out the survey so we can help keep making these webinars better and better and more relevant and more valuable. So thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.